Firelight licked the skin of steel. Sparks flared, bright as stars caught in a barrel, and a smell rose, hot metal and oil, and something like old iron memory. A man's forearm, blackened at the cuff, moved with practiced economy. A hammer, a chisel, the steady press of a rivet gun. The furnace behind him coughed and glowed. Metal changed from soft gray to molten orange, then to shape. Around the pit, the factory hummed like a living thing. Pulleys, belts, the distant cough of a drill press, the whispered curses of tired men. Every so often a lighter snapped, and the cigarette smoke braided with the heat, curling up into the rafters. In that light, pieces that would later be called weapons were only metal in hands, the curvature of a gun shield, the taper of a barrel, the small, almost intimate seam where two plates met and were forced into a bond that would have to hold under stress nobody wanted to imagine until they had to. Worn palms smoothed the edges. A machinist checked the bore with a rod. An armorer laid out cartridges like marching soldiers, neat, orderly, each one a promise. Every spark that fell from a grinder spoke the same sentence. Somebody made this. Somebody cared enough to make it right. And high above, where the sea of cloud and sky met, those same hands would pull triggers, seatbelts biting into flesh, eyes narrowing against sun and wind. Men who had bent the metal in the factories would someday lean into turrets and look down the throat of a world at war. They would learn, sometimes the hard way, that appearances could be deceiving. They would learn that something the enemy called slow could, in fact, be lethal. They called it slow. They said it lumbered, an easy mark for any hungry fighter. The B-17 flying fortress, bulkier than sleek German fighters, less nimble than some twin-engine bombers, carried a reputation almost as heavy as its frame. To the pilots watching from their fast Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, it looked like something that should be shot first and thought of later. It drifted into view. It seemed not worth worry. Yet inside that slow silhouette lived an arrangement of defenses so deliberate and so concentrated that when the right man and the right metal met in the right moment, the sky itself could be split by lead. If you appreciate stories of engineering and grit, tap like. The question in that single flicker of contempt, why bother, is the question this story answers. How did a bomber whose profile suggested passivity become an instrument of concentrated defensive violence, so much that an approaching fighter could be met by a curtain of fire and forced away? The answer lives in design decisions, in doctrine, in the stubborn discipline of crews who wanted to come home, and in the hands that polished barrels by the light of a factory's last lamp. It is a story that begins in the heat and ends, briefly for now, in a moment when tracer light cuts the sky like a new constellation.
The B-17 began as an answer to a problem: get heavy loads, munitions, fuel, range, over long distances and deliver them where they mattered. It was not designed for ballet, it was designed for endurance. With range and altitude came exposure. A bomber had to survive not by speed but by other means. Designers and tacticians converged on a principle that would define the flying fortress: if you cannot outrun a fighter, make the fighter pay when it closes. That principle birthed the idea of concentrated, overlapping defensive fire. The machine that would carry it most famously did so with a battery of heavy .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, a weapon already proven in many theaters for its stopping power. The typical arrangements placed guns so that no approach vector went unguarded: guns forward to meet head-on attacks, guns above and below to protect from diving passes, flank positions to sweep the sides, and a gun in the tail to discourage pursuit. Each gun was a point. Together, they formed nets of steel and flame. When technicians spoke of fields of fire, they meant the arcs a gun could sweep without obstruction, the invisible cones through which bullets would fly. The genius of the fortress lay not just in having many guns, but in arranging them so that those cones overlapped. Two arcs crossing meant a denser zone of fire. Many arcs converging made a corridor, an actual corridor, through which an attacker would have to pass. Tracer rounds, metal jackets filled with incendiary tips or incendiary tracers, painted that corridor in light. At night, under cloud or against the white of high-altitude air, those tracers were lines scribbling across space. To an attacking pilot, they read like danger, like weather made of lead. Technical names do their work, but they can make things dry. A simpler image helps. Imagine a hedgerow around a house. If you try to jump the hedgerow at a single point, you are likely to be caught by a branch. If every possible jump is covered by barbed twine, your odds shrink. The B-17's guns were that barbed twine for the sky. They were not a single unerring cannon. They were a coordinated system built to channel and deny. Against it, a lone fighter could be a strike and a ruin at once. There is a human logic to that design. One turret's gunnery is limited by its arc, but multiple turrets can compensate. One tired gunner might miss. A spread of disciplined men could correct each other, covering blind spots and overlapping fire to make individual mistakes less deadly. Formation flying turned this multi-directional defense into a communal one. When B-17s flew in tight boxes, their guns could converge outward in overlapping beams. A fighter approaching one ship risked running the gauntlet thrown by all. Back on the ground, where the metal was made and kept ready, the work needed for that doctrine was not glamorous. It was punctuality and cleaning and the precise smoothing of parts.
In the dim back corner of a plant, beyond the drilling rigs and away from the supervisory glass, men and women labored over lesser-known details that would make the difference between function and catastrophe. An armor shop was a small kingdom of sockets and wrenches, with spanners laid out like instruments on an operating table. A young woman, hands raw at the knuckles, would seat rounds into belts with the concentration of a watchmaker. An old river, who had seen a dozen contracts, applied rivets as if he were suturing a wound. Their names are not famous. Their faces, in archive photos, blur beneath caps and grease. But their decisions, how tight to fasten, whether to reline a bore a fraction more, kept gunners alive. One man who might stand for them all had a way of moving that suggested a deep compensation for the smallness of his station. He was not the headline designer, not the colonel making doctrine. He was the foreman of a section that repaired barrel liners and mounted sights. When he walked across the shop, he carried a cloth bundle under his arm, and inside were lenses, small springs, and sighting reticles. He kept a notebook filled with trial notes, written in a cramped hand. And sometimes on Sundays, he took the book to the railway and watched a freight train shutter by, thinking about recoil and tolerances. He believed that a gun that pointed true was half of a life saved. On a night shift in mid-1943, his shop received a squadron of barrels that had been fired more than they should have been. The men who brought them in were gray-eyed and hurried. They had been pulled from a mission where flak had been thick and return rates thin. The foreman sat the barrels on the bench and turned the light low so the lands and grooves glinted like a map. His apprentice, someone with the slow patience of youth, handed him a scraper for the chamber. The foreman worked with hands that had seen war long enough to know what a bent extractor could cost. He cleaned and measured and patched. Then he called for replacement liners. He stayed late, polishing the muzzle, and when he left the plant, the sky was a pale smear above the rooftops, and his palm left a dark print on the door handle. Those factory stories run parallel to stories in the air. On board a B-17, the gunners were a micro-society. The ball turret, like an iron mandible beneath the fuselage, housed a single man whose world was the rounded glass of his sphere and the instruments clenched into the herky-jerky arc of night and day. He could see the belly of the sky and the ocean of silver below. He could also see the undersides of his own comrades, staggered in formation like the teeth of a saw. In the waist positions, two men shared breaths and cigarette smoke and a mutual watchfulness. Someone to check the glove, someone to say the word left if a shadow moved there. The tail gunner sat in a room that felt like a confession booth, the plane stern and the last line of contact with pursuing fighters. Forward, in nose and top turrets, other hands felt the airplane's first answer to danger. A particular gunner, an archetype of the quiet and steady breed, kept his things meticulously. His leather gloves were mended at the fingertips with heavy thread. He kept a priest's prayer tucked in a pocket, not because he was holy, but because the practice steadied him. He had learned to tune his senses in small ways, the way a turret whine would change under different throttle settings, the timing of the formation's breathe, as gunners called it, an intake of breath to steady before an anticipated pass. He could feel when the bomber behind him fell a fraction out of step. That shift could widen a blind spot and make a flank attack possible.
He watched the sky for the glint of fuel tanks or the wink of a canopy, and he listened for the serrated ping of near misses, the sound of metal that had tasted a bullet and decided whether to carry on. The training to make all of that coordinated efficiency happen was discipline made routine. Gunnery schools taught men to lead a target, not to point at where the enemy was, but where he would be when the bullets arrived, to factor in closure speed, angle of attack, and wind. Formation drills trained crews to hold position, to bank together and present a united front, to understand that discipline in the air translated to concentrated firepower on the ground. Communication protocols, simple calls over intercoms, coded words passed through headsets, kept the manifold of guns from becoming chaos. When a fighter dove from the sun, when a wingman signaled a port approach, the gunner's eyes worked like a net, each man predicting and compensating for a neighbor's small error. The weapons themselves were straightforward in the way of instruments that had to be robust. The Browning .5 caliber M2 was not elegant. It was a large, heavy weapon that fired large, heavy rounds. It made a sound like a machine obeying a deep voice. Two things made it feared: the mass of each round, capable of piercing engines and structures at combat distances, and the rate at which they could be put into space, dozens a second when the guns were fed properly and the barrels were cooled enough to keep from warping. Tracer rounds mixed into belts allowed gunners to see their fire's path and to concentrate it on a chosen point. When gunners spoke of concentrations, they meant a specific point in space, an intersection of arcs, where they would lay the weight of fire until the attackers either withdrew or ceased to be in formation. The practical problem could be boiled down to geometry and will.
Geometry set the cones and arcs. Will meted out the timing. For overlapping fields to become a wall, gunners had to hold their fire until the attacking plane entered a predetermined zone. Hesitation made opportunities. Indiscriminate spraying wasted ammunition and created holes in coverage. Discipline meant patience, waiting for the lead and the drift and the right moment to press triggers in a chorus. At times, gunners practiced in mock engagements. An old instructor might stand on a trainer and swing a wooden target on wires to simulate a passing fighter. Students learned to breathe with the aircraft and to place bullets not with a panic, but with measurable intent. They learned that a good volley could blunt an attack, but only if it was concentrated. They learned that ammunition would run out if not husbanded. One did not waste a barrage on a passing shadow. The discipline taught in those schools turned into muscle memory. In the heat of combat, a man would not calculate in the cold terms of classroom. He would act reflexively, according to the patterns hammered into him by training. Formation mattered as much as the guns. A B-17 flying by itself was vulnerable. One in a box became a fortress of interlocking arcs. Pilots drilled into their men the spacing, the altitude discipline. Too tight, and the risk of collision rose. Too loose, and the fighter could slip into seams, those thin, dangerous corridors between arcs. Commanders worked to find the sweet spot. They hammered into crews the idea of the defensive box. In that box, the machine guns were not individual defenders, but a weave. From a fighter's perspective, the box looked like a thicket of steel and light. Fighters that had seen the fortress up close sometimes remembered the shock of its concentrated reply. A pilot who walked into a concentrated stream of .50 caliber rounds remembered the way tracer light chopped the sky and the way his canopy seemed to fill with a rain that stung. But until that moment, many pilots judged by silhouette and by speed. A low, lumbering shape suggested an easy target. There existed a bias. Speed suggested danger. Weight suggested safety. The B-17 learned to exploit that bias. Tactics on the attacker's side were evolving too. Early on, some Luftwaffe pilots discovered that head-on passes could work. Others favored high-speed slashing attacks from above. New defensive layouts, such as placing guns in the nose to meet head-on approaches, forced pilots to adapt. Each adaptation sparked a counter-adaptation. War is, in many ways, a long conversation between opposing doctrines, each speaking in bullets and maneuver. The men who made the guns and those who manned them understood this conversation in different registers. In the plant, decisions were made to lengthen a sight or change an elevating gear with the cold calculus of parts and function. In the air, decisions were made in seconds. Tighten formation 3 degrees. Feed a belt. Hold fire.
Both kinds of decisions were essential. The foreman in the shop may have polished a sight to a shine. The gunner may have kept his breath and taken the shot that finished a pass. Both acts were linked by lineage and by necessity. It is difficult in the abstract to transmit the sensation of an approaching attacker to someone who has never seen a sky full of combat. The first cue is light. A fighter flashes, a glint on a wing, the silver of propeller blades catching sunlight. Then a sound, a thin, high whine that jumps in pitch as it closes. Then geometry, a vector plotted in the gunner's mind. The gunners who survived most often spoke of time stretching. In that stretch, they could see choices laid out. Break left, let the flight leader bank, put all fire into the right-hand arc. The decision must be fast, and it must be communal. On a clear morning over the channel, the exercise shifted from abstract to imminent. Intelligence had reported enemy fighters in the area. The formation tightened. Radios crackled with clipped messages. Beneath the hum, a tension moved like an inhalation through the crew. The navigator checked the clock. The bombardier peered through the nose glass. The pilots kept their hands soft on the yoke. The gunners of a particular ship, call it for the sake of the imagination, Fortress 32, ran their checks. The ball turret man cycled his twin guns, felt the piston under his palm. The waist gunners slapped spare belts into place and flexed their fingers against leather. They did not speak loud. Words would only betray adrenaline. Then a call came over the frequency. Bogies, 1 o'clock, diving. Eyes rose to the sky. At first nothing but blue for miles, then a pinpoint, then a glint, then an engine roar that seemed to arrive late. From the enemy's angle, the formation looked like a line of slow blue whales, lumbering and dense. The lead pilot of the attackers, confident in his speed and the ferocity of his machine, aimed to cut through the formation, hoping to pick off stragglers, to find seams and make an example. From their vantage, the enemy looked small, almost fragile. Slow, the pilot thought. This is what he had judged. He had seen formations before, had skimmed the perimeters of bombers with negligible cost. He had the reflex of attack bred in hours over training fields. He hunched over his controls and began the run. His cannon were hot with practice, and like all pilots who trust in speed, he trusted that momentum could solve his math. On the B-17, the gunner's training and the factory's workmanship converged. The men felt the aircraft's slight shiver as the fighters closed. For a few heartbeats, there was a mutual calculus. How fast are they closing? Who will see them first? Where will they strike? The ball turret man squeezed an imaginary trigger in his palm. The top turret man checked his sight and found the little notch he had centered 1,000 times.
Around them, belts clicked, and the sound of mechanisms synchronized into a soft, dangerous music. The moment before contact is not empty. It bristles. That bristle is the space where doctrine can work its will. If the gunners hold, if formation keeps its line, an approaching fighter will find that the corridor he intends to pass through has been prepared for him. It will enter a place where bullets are already ranged, where the geometry of overlapping arcs makes the air itself thick with fire. From the cockpit of the attacking fighter, a flicker of that reality can be seen too late. The first tracer torching past the wing, the second, the way light seems to draw straight lines toward a point in space. A pilot could attempt evasive action, a roll, a dive, a sudden climb. But once within the web, options narrow. The defender has time and people. The attacker has only a moment and a machine. The history books keep numbers and maneuvers, but those who lived through the moments recall mental images more than hard coordinates. A wall of lead is how many pilots describe the sensation. Not a poetic flourish, but a functional one. It was a perceivable, almost tactile barrier that the fighter found itself crossing. Tracer ribbons formed straight, unforgiving planes of light. Guns elevated in concert. The gun's report became a continuous roar, a machine chorus. For a pilot who expected a quick strike and a swift departure, the sky looked suddenly hostile in a way that had no warning the eye could parse. Not every approach ended in catastrophe for the attacker. Discipline on the bomber's part could be imperfect. Clouds could open, creating slits for a fighter to slip through. Ammunition could run low. A gun might hang just as the pass began. War is generous with contingencies. But under the right conditions, trained gunners, tight formation, properly serviced weapons, the B-17's arrangement of 50 caliber weapons could transform the attacker's calculus in an instant. The space that looked easy from afar was up close, a hazard so concentrated that pilots recalibrated what they thought they knew. As the enemy plane completed its first small line run across the formation, alerts flashed in the minds of every man on the B-17. The gunners withheld fire, conditioned by training, was about to be tested. The factory had done its work. The guns were clean. The belts were full. The men in the air, whose hands were both steadied and scarred from practice, had to turn doctrine into an answer that came in the language of metal. The geometry was laid. The timing was theirs. This is the point where braid and barrel meet,
where the industriousness of men in shops meets the reflexes of men in turrets. The sky tightened. The fighter hunched into its run. The gunners felt the moment's weight like a thing in their palms. If they opened now, if they synchronized their bursts, the effect would be immediate and brutal, a physical translation of planning into consequence.
If they misfired, or fired too soon, or fired too late, the result would be a wasted chance. Something in one pilot's face, if one could read such things from a cockpit, changed. Confidence gave way to calculation. Through the visor, he saw the light that should not have been there. He saw lines of fire congeal and understood, perhaps too late, that the shape he had dismissed as slow had become a wall, that his approach had been mapped and turned back on him. The decision to press home the attack, to break or to cling, pressed at him like an unwelcome thought. At this threshold, between approach and impact, both sides lived in a compressed world. On the ground, the men who had readied the guns held a faith that their work might, in the span of a single decision, keep a plane intact and a crew alive. Up high, gunners were about to test that faith against an opponent who had, until this moment, underestimated the price that would be charged. Then the first flame blossomed. It began not as a roar, but as a precise punctuation. A hot, white flash at the mouth of a barrel, followed by the metallic arithmetic of recoil. For an instant, every gun seemed to be performing a separate calculation. Then those calculations folded into one. Muzzles erupted in sequence and in unison, an engineered chorus where each throat of steel knew when to speak. Tracer rounds stitched the sky with thin orange threads, and those threads came together as if woven by an unseen hand. What had been a column of disparate arcs and cones of fire resolved into a plane, a sheet of tracer light silhouetting the attacking formation like a theater curtain drawn across the horizon. The wall of lead was not a single sound, but a compound texture. The chuff-chuff rhythm of browning barrels, the higher, brittle chord of tracer tips igniting air, the deeper, almost felt vibration as rounds found metal and made it sing. Underneath all that, there was the human sound, the soft, taut breathing over headsets, the clack of belts, the low curse or whisper that lives in men when they perform a task that risks everything. The ball turret's small world flashed to life in the reflection of tracer glow. The turret man's whole face was a map of concentration, jawed tight against the G-force and the returned pressure of the turret seat. From the fighter's cockpit, the first impression was dislocation. Time narrowed. The small, high notes of an engine's whine became a wrongness as the tracers converged. A pilot who had expected a quick punch through a thin flank instead saw the sky filled with filaments, themselves arranged into an obstacle. The lead man blinked at a cascade of light that seemed to hang insolently in space. His instincts told him to keep the line. He had speed. But a new variable had been introduced: volume of fire. The B-17 was not a single gun at a single point. It was 13 axes of response, and together they carved a barrier. Discipline showed. Gunners had held their breath until the geometry matched their plan. They did not spray indiscriminately. They did not let reflex alone govern their fingers. They opened in coordinated bursts, the kind drilled into them in cold classrooms and in the long hours of repetitive training. The result was a concentrated cone of damage rather than a scattered, wasteful hail. Bullets intersected where they were meant to, and that intersection made the difference between an attacker sliding through scars and an attacker running a gauntlet. The fighter's airframe answered first in sound. The staccato of hits, metal struck, control surfaces pinging with their own tiny bells, reordered the pilot's priorities. Instruments jittered. Oil pressure fluttered on a dial. The canopy shimmered as near-miss waves danced along it. For a pilot plunging into that lane of concentrated fire, the sensation was less like being shot at and more like trying to walk through a wall that was not solid but had the same persistent, erosive effect. Pieces of paint and fairing peeled away. One machine trailed vapor and a slow, thin smoke that darkened quickly into a smear. Another began to roll, not from a single catastrophic hit, but from the cumulative effect of slatted impacts that unbalanced wings and chewed at hinges. Orders were shouted into headsets. Formations tried to close ranks. But the logic of the engagement had shifted. What had looked like an easy silhouette at a distance had at close range become a coordinated expression of someone else's planning. The attackers who had expected a rapid victory found themselves instead choosing between immediate risk and a slower, more dangerous exit. Some pulled off, burning desperation into the slipstream. Some circled away to mount another, more cautious run, eyes now measuring not only target, but the pattern of fire it would meet. A few tried to get lower, to use cloud and ground to obscure the forms of the box. None of those choices was clean. Each trade-off exchanged immediacy for exposure, confidence for calculation. Inside Fortress Birdie 2, each man registered the outcome in a personal ledger of relief and loss. The tail gunner felt the heels of his gloves grow sticky with sweat and something less definable, not joy, but a gravity that settles after danger has passed. The waist gunners glanced at each other and offered no high voices. The ball turret man rotated his sphere back to the stow and felt his knees shake as if he had run very hard. The plane itself, a loaded instrument of weight and intent, flexed in the airflow as if glad to carry its crew another mile. Back in the repair shop, in the red and black of spent furnace light and the colder blue of oil-stained lamps, the foreman lifted his face from a scope as the radio's thin voice crackled through to a public frequency. He did not know the names of the men in the turret or the tail, but he felt the same elation that settles over someone whose work has just proven true.
He set aside a lens, rubbed his hands, and watched the dust motes turn in the lamp's cone. He had tightened tolerances on a site the week before and had argued for swapping a spring. Those small arguments, once dismissed by men with grander titles, now seemed like tiny votes in favor of survival. The plant's women and men gathered around a notice board where a hand-cranked radio was set in a corner. A headline on a smudged memo came alive, an engagement over the channel, fighters repulsed. They listened to the voice that reported facts and withheld the kind of celebration that would have felt false. When the foreman finally spoke, he was measured. "We did our bit," he said, and that sentence carried all the pride and all the sorrow such a moment allowed. They had given the world metal that could end a life. They had also given the world a way to keep their own from ending. The balance felt precarious, moral and mechanical at once. Tactically, the engagement offered lessons that would ripple outward. Commanders debriefed their crews with new questions. How had the attacking pilots misread the defensive geometry? Where had the formation held too tight or too loose? How much had the gun's concentrated fire forced the bomber's advantage? More broadly, planners on both sides took note. For fighter squadrons, the lesson was stinging. Speed and silhouette were insufficient guarantees. For bomber crews, the lesson was reinforcing. When doctrine, discipline, and well-maintained tools aligned, survival odds improved. That alignment was never automatic. A gun could jam, a belt could feed wrong, a sight could fog. Luck had a hand in every successful defense. But the encounter demonstrated something more important than luck, the idea that industrial will, people working tirelessly to make a system operate, could be translated into tactical effect. The plane that looked slow had been rendered lethal not by accident, but by the labor of thousands of small acts. A sight tweaked, a barrel relined, a crew drilled until repetition erased panic's power. The Axis pilots who had first shrugged at the flying fortress modified their behavior in small, incremental ways. Some began to test head-on attacks, where the defenders' noses and forward guns could be met in a contest of speed and initial snapshots, a tactic that demanded nerve but reduced exposure to overlapping flanks. Others coordinated with escort fighters to draw defensive fire and then slip around to a safer vector. Still others shifted to higher altitude slashes, using altitude to add energy to their dives and reduce the time they spend inside the most concentrated intersecting arcs. Each adaptation was itself an admission. The old assumptions about the B-17 had to be revised. Yet tactics tell only part of the story. The psychological effect of having misjudged an opponent can be profound.
Pilots who had once treated the fortress as a mere target began in subtle ways to respect the complexity of the systems they faced. That respect did not mean love. It meant a new caution, a recalibration of risk. For bomber crews, the moment when their collective discipline translated into survival was an affirmation of the old teaching: hold your position, trust your wingman, and make your weapons count. The engagement's immediate outcomes were messy and ambiguous in the cold ledger of war. Some attackers were driven off, some were hit and forced to limp home, others found success where the box opened like a seam. Reports varied by squadron, by logbook entry, by a pilot's need to justify a close run. Histories would later attempt to make sense of such encounters with crisp numbers and tidy causal chains, but the men who had been there remembered particulars. The way the tracer arcs seemed to snap like barbed wire, the metallic taste in the mouth after a long burst, the strange, wobbly sense of being spared. They remembered, too, the losses, the nearest friend of a gunner who did not come back from a later sortie, the plant worker whose son never returned, the draft of grief that sometimes blew through a repair bay like winter air. There is always a moral dimension to such engineering triumphs. The same precision that yields a wall of lead can also produce ruin on the ground. Crews and factory foremen understood that their work was wrapped in contradiction. A life preserved by a gun is a life that, at another hour, might be used to take life. It is a tension carried in the small gestures, an armor worker pausing to wipe tears while a barrel is polished, a gunner saying a quiet word, not of triumph, but of sorrow when the fight ends. The narrative of human ingenuity in wartime is not a tidy tale of progress. It is a ledger heavy with trade-offs. After the action, reports filtered up through squadrons, then through wings, with technicians and commanders parsing what had happened. Mechanics signed their names to maintenance sheets that certified readiness. Gunners wrote down angles and times and small mistakes they meant to correct. The foreman annotated his notebook with a new entry that read less like pride and more like duty. Check spare springs on 7-9 mounts. Verify feet alignment. He would change the list of parts to be stocked and would argue for another shift to keep spares flowing. The plant would adjust its priorities, not to celebrate victory, but to prepare for the next hour that demanded readiness. In the months and years that followed, the image of a plane that punched above its weight took root in public memory. Photographs circulated of formations with tracer overlays, images that told a double story, one of technical capability, another of human cost. The fortress, called slow by many who judged only by lines and speed, acquired a reputation built on collective defense. That reputation mattered beyond the airframe itself.
It shaped doctrine, influenced training priorities, and informed the way industrial supply chains were run. Factories that had once made parts for engines adjusted to produce spares for gunnery and sighting systems. Armaments shops expanded, and suppliers of metalwork found new orders that required speed and precision in equal measure. The human stories multiplied. The ball turret man would later work in a small machine shop, fingers steadied by years of careful movement. He kept the same notebook he had carried in the turret, and crowded in its margins were sketches of arcs and angles, little geometries that made sense of an event that had once seemed chaotic. The foreman, at the end of the war, sat in a quieter corner of a larger plant and told a young apprentice about the night he had heard the crackling radio and felt that long, private relief. "We did our bit," he repeated, but his voice always carried that extra weight, because even doing your bit had cost much. Scatterings of cultural memory treated the sight of the wall of lead as almost mythical. Pilots speaking later in interviews of a sky raining light. Gunners recalling tracer ribbons like urban neon drawn across cloud. Those metaphors reached a public hungry for stories that combined gritty human work with the glamour of machinery. Yet beneath the metaphors were concrete changes. Training schedules rewritten to emphasize coordinated fire, maintenance protocols tightened to reduce chance failures, and a strategic understanding that defensive firepower could be decisive when properly integrated with formation doctrine. Statistically precise claims about how many engagements turned because of concentrated fire are difficult to make without careful archival work. Many records are incomplete or conflicting, but the qualitative effect was clear to those involved. A fighter approaching a formation had to contend not just with a single gun, but with a practiced multiplication of defense. That multiplication was the product of design, doctrine, and the relentless small-scale labor that turned parts into promise. There were costs beyond the immediate exchange. Factories strained under demand. Men and women worked extra shifts, their hands growing raw and their eyes tired. National economies rerouted resources to feed the insatiable appetite of war production. Men who had once been apprentices found themselves supervising shifts and learning how to live with the moral complexity of what they were making. Some left the industry after the war, unable to reconcile their contributions with memories of damaged cities and civilian suffering. Others stayed, finding in their labor a kind of post-war vocation, to build peacetime uses for skills honed in conflict,
to translate expertise in metallurgy and precision into engines and tools that powered Reconstruction. The scene closes as it began, in the flicker between metal and light.
The foreman, years older, will later go back to the plant for a reunion. They will stand for a moment under the same rafters, now patched and brightened by paint and time, and he will trace with a fingertip the outline of a muzzle guard displayed in a glass case. The smell of oil will lift like a memory. He will think of sparks, those small flashes in a foundry, and those tracer threads in a sky, and he will understand how both kinds of light were born of the same hands. Across the channels in the years, the image of the slow bomber that could halt a determined attacker continued to teach an enduring lesson. Appearances are only the starting point of judgment. Engineering can be deceptive in its modesty. A machine that looks ungainly can hold within it a geometry of defense. That geometry is less about technical arrogance than about disciplined cooperation between men in God knows what hour shifts turning wrenches and men in turrets trusting one another's aim. And yet the lesson does not sit in pride alone. It sits also in sorrow. The same factory that produced the guns also produced parts for engines and for life-saving devices. Technology is an amplifier of human will, indifferent to the particular directions that will might take. The men and women who labored over barrels and belts carried, like everyone at war, a mixed inheritance, the satisfaction of craft and the heavy work of conscience. The story of the Wall of Lead is at root a story about choices, technical choices, training choices, and moral choices. On a clear morning years later, when veterans and workers gather to remember, someone will tell the story as if it were a parable about diligence. They will say that the sky is a strange place to learn the value of hands, but there, in the collision of effort and danger, the lesson becomes undeniable. A slow plane can be dangerous not because of speed, but because of intent. The intention to defend, to hold position, to make metal answer to human will in the narrowest of spaces. The last image is small and stubborn, a single dull spark falling from a grinder in a quiet shop, the way light breaks from metal in a hush. It is the same light that once formed a line across the sky, only smaller now, only a memory. But in that spark lives the same commitment. It is the product of someone who stayed late to check a sight, of a man who learned to feel rifling with his hands, of the gunner who kept his breath when the world demanded quickness. The spark is not an exoneration. It is a reminder. If you want more deep dives into the machines and people who shaped history, subscribe.